All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fifth installment of our Acadiana Business Resource webinar series. My name is Andre Bro, and I work on the team at One Acadiana. Our Acadiana Business Resource webinars are brought to you by business resource partners from across the Acadiana region, including One Acadiana, LEDA, Opportunity Machine, the Downtown Development Authority, the Louisiana Small Business Development Center at UL Lafayette, Acadiana Workforce Solutions, the United Way of Acadiana, and other local chambers and economic development offices from around the Acadiana region. We have come together to support Acadiana's business community, particularly our small businesses, in response to COVID-19 by hosting a series of webinars on timely and relevant topics. Today's webinar is presented by Gifford Briggs, President of the Louisiana Oil and Gas Association, and Representative Jean-Paul Coussan, State Representative for District 45 in Lafayette. They will be presenting on COVID-19 and the oil and gas industry in Acadiana. After the presentation, we will use the remaining time for Q&A. As you have questions, please enter them into the chat bot, which can be accessed using the chat bubble icon. We will be recording the questions as we go. If we do not have time to get to your question during today's webinar, we will try to follow up with you as soon as possible afterwards. Without further ado, I will now turn it over to Gifford Briggs to kick off our presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Andre. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with everyone this morning, and I hope everyone is safe and healthy and taking the necessary steps to combat this horrible pandemic that we're all dealing with. Today we're going to talk a little bit about oil prices and energy prices generally, and what the impact is for the oil and gas industry, and look a little bit about what the impact is on Acadiana. We know that Lafayette and Acadiana have over the years diversified their economy, but the oil and gas industry is still remains the heart of Acadiana. And the challenges that we're facing as an industry will certainly be faced there. So we can go to the next slide, Andre. So what we're dealing with here for the industry is really, it's a perfect storm. The challenges that are coming out of COVID-19 are significant, but they aren't the only issue that we're facing as it comes to oil and gas prices. If it was just COVID-19, it would still be a serious issue, but it's more than that. All right, Andre, we can go to the next one. When we say a perfect storm, what we're dealing with is a complete destruction of supply and demand economics on the oil side. And it really started before COVID-19. With on the supply side. On March 6th, we were finishing up our annual meeting in Lake Charles, first joint meeting with the Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association, 3 days of celebration of the oil and gas industry in preparation for an incredible upcoming legislative session in which major legislative initiatives are going to be moving forward to propel the oil and gas industry forward. Almost as we were coming out of our board meeting that day, Russia and OPEC and OPEC Plus announced that they were breaking up, if you will, and decided to go back and no longer maintain the production cuts that they put in place in 2016. The last price crash we had started in November of 14. And then over a period of 3 or 4 months, the prices declined from 65 to, from 75 down to 45, leading the last crash that we had in the industry. That continued for a year and a half, almost 2 years, when OPEC and Russia got together, having destroyed much of the U.S. Shale and production industry, and decided to cut production and drive prices back up. Well, those cuts were scheduled to be renewed. Meeting, they decided that they were not going to reach a production cut agreement. Both Russia and Saudi Arabia walked away from the meeting, signaling they were going to be be increasing production. And that drove costs down, or price of oil down from $45 down to $30 over the course of a weekend. Following that, the U.S. began its efforts to deal with COVID-19 and began sheltering home. People began to cancel vacations, began to cancel travel plans, and we saw what happened in Italy and China, and so we saw this global demand for energy start to decrease. In the month of March, it's expected that the global demand for oil went down about 10 million barrels a day, which is about a 10% decrease in global demand. And when you've got supply going up by millions of barrels per day and demand going down by 10%, the only place for prices to go is down. And that's why this is really a perfect storm, because we're fighting both the supply side and the demand side for oil. We'll go to the next slide. And so what we've seen is prices were already falling a little bit through the beginning of the year, but we have now seen for oil since the beginning of the year a 66% decrease in the first quarter from basically from January 1 till April 1. And there's not many industries that can survive this type of a price decline in such a short period of time. And you know, if you can look at your own household income now, or your own businesses that you all have, and many of you are dealing with some of these challenges because of the shelter and home orders, but the challenges that come out of a 66% decrease in effectively income in just one quarter are very difficult for companies to deal with. And you know, they've begun making adjustments already. Next slide. So one of the other challenges is not something that you know we ever really talk that much about. We talk about OPEC and their ability to control prices, and they can open the valves. But when we're talking about the difference between supply and demand, we're generally talking about 2 or 3 million barrels, maybe in either direction. Maybe supply is outpacing demand by a few million barrels, or demand's outpacing supply by a few million barrels. Nothing. We haven't seen anything like what we're talking about today. And so if you look at those, the 2 points at the end, those are the months of March and April, where we've got a 10 million barrel per day predicted surplus for the month of March. And for the month of April, it's being predicted in anywhere from 15 to 30 million barrels per day of excess demand. Of excess supply. And when you have this much surplus, it's got to go somewhere. It can't go to the refineries, because the refineries they're sitting on stocks of gasoline that they don't have a market for. They don't have a market for their jet fuel. They don't have a market for the regular transportation fuels, and so they can't refine the product. And so we're having to find storage facilities to be able to put it. Well, when you're doing 10 million barrels a day globally, or 20 million barrels a day globally, you begin running out of storage capacity very, very quickly. And so if you just think about it, if we're doing 20 million barrels a day surplus, and we've got to find a place for it, in 50 days, that puts 1 billion barrels of oil in storage. And that's really what we're looking at for the month of April and beginning parts of May. We only have about 1.6 billion barrels globally of total available storage. So it doesn't take into account the extra storage that we had in the month of March already. But between March and May, we can totally fill up any usable capacity for storage. And that includes tankers floating around in the oceans, every available storage facility, all the strategic reserves. And when that happens and there's no place for the product to go, it can't be. Next slide. So one of the things that's very difficult for us for everyone to understand, you know, while there may be capacity for storage at a global level, that doesn't necessarily tell the story at a local level. And so when we're seeing prices that are trading on the futures market, that doesn't necessarily reflect what's really going on in different localities. And so while we've seen, West Texas Intermediate even today in $25-26 range, we have already seen negative oil prices in the United States, which means that not only do you have to pay someone to transport the oil, you're actually going to pay them a per barrel fee. We saw this with natural gas in the Permian Basin in 2019. And in some places in the United States, we're seeing it. We've seen Wyoming oil for $1.60. But if we bring it home here to Louisiana, we've started to hear from producers that for the oil that they are producing to bring to market in months of May, that not only are they not maybe going to be able to purchase all of the oil that the producer was producing, but that the price for that oil has been as low as $10, $8, $6. And so we are seeing significantly lower prices locally for the month of May than what we're seeing, what's being traded at the stock exchange level. Next slide. So what's next? The reality is that if there isn't any broad scale global agreement to reduce demand by enough to bring the market into balance, then we're going to see prices for oil that we would not have imagined, and that's well below $20. In this particular article on from IHS market research, it said brutal, unadulterated market forces, and that's what we're going to see when oil hits $5 and all the wells start getting shut in. And that is one way for supply to get disrupted if there's not a global agreement put in place in order to address the challenges that we're facing with just global decreasing demand. And it's got to be an international agreement. It used to be that when we were talking about a supply and demand balance, and supply is outpacing demand by 2 or 3 million barrels, that the Saudis could go in there and they could, turn the spigot a little bit and bring everything back into balance. When we're talking about a 30% or 25% decrease in global oil demand, to get to 20 million barrels, Saudi Arabia and Russia both would have to not pump another barrel of oil to make cuts of 20 million barrels. And that's just not possible. We know that President Trump sent out a tweet that sent prices climbing last Friday that says that Saudi Arabia and Russia have agreed to 10 to 15 million barrels per day. And then sort of later walked that back a little bit, and they're considering 10 to 15 million barrels a day, which Saudi Arabia and Russia both walked back, because for Saudi Arabia and Russia to agree to 10 to 15 million barrel per day cut, they would each have to reduce their production of oil by 50%. And these are countries that a month ago said that they were ready to wage war on U.S. shale producers to drive them out of the market by putting more oil onto the market, not less. And so, the reality of an international agreement to reduce production to levels that would be significant enough to impact pricing, those are very real challenges. And it's not something that's going to happen very easily, and certainly not very quickly. Next slide. We were supposed to have a big meeting yesterday, and that meeting got canceled. and that meeting got moved to April 9th. And this is a meeting of OPEC plus, Russia, Saudi Arabia, all the OPEC producing countries, as well as representatives from the United States, Canada, Venezuela, Mexico, and other non-OPEC traditional allies. And Saudi Arabia and Russia have both signaled that they are willing to discuss production cuts. However, that is only possible if the United States and other producers join in. And so if, we want to get to 15 million barrels a day, that means that we need 15% reduction from every country across the board. And for some countries, they can make that happen. For the United States, it doesn't work that way. Antitrust laws and the rules and regulations that we have here in the United States make it impossible for companies to come together to exert this kind of force on the market to agree to these cuts. So unless the federal government is going to come down and say that and mandate it, or then the reality of the U.S. being able to participate in this international global production cut are very slim, which means it's less likely for all of the rest of the countries, and Saudi Arabia and Russia in particular, to want to cut their production. If we're not going to do it, it certainly seems that they're not going to do it. We've had conversations in Louisiana right now about what does that look like for us? Well, Texas is looking at some of the laws they have to maybe enforce a production cut. But if Texas does it and Louisiana does it and the Gulf of Mexico doesn't, or Oklahoma doesn't and North Dakota doesn't, it doesn't really work, because the prices might rise and those states that are not participating will receive the benefit from it. They'll increase production and it doesn't work. So for the United States, for Louisiana, we can participate in that through the Office of Conservation, but only if the federal government is going to look at it and say, this is something that we are going to force down upon every state. And the reality of making that happen in the next 3 days and dealing with the challenges that we're already dealing with COVID-19, there's not a lot of necessarily optimism right now. For Russia and Saudi Arabia, they can get through this. They've got the reserves to be able to weather the storm. Before the demand side of the equation collapsed, they were modeling 2 years or longer at $20 and $10 oil to understand what it would look like for their country to be able to survive, because they want to get market share back. And if they can crush the shale producers again, they can get their market share back. And the impact long-term from them, both from a financial side and a political power and political influence side, which is what they're aiming for, would be significant if the U.S. was reduced from 12 million barrels a day back down to 5. Next slide. And so our price challenges, while a lot of the energy is focused on the oil side, we're still do a lot of natural gas production in Louisiana, both in the Haynesville Shale, also in South Louisiana, and servicing the Gulf of Mexico. And so, sometimes you get a little bit of support. When oil goes down, gas stays up or stays, at sustainable rates. But we've seen the same 60% reduction in the price of oil. We've seen it in gas. It just started in November and has gone pretty much straight down. It's traded as low as $1.55 an MCF. And the challenge is with natural gas low, which is good, but with oil as low as it is, our LNG markets are going to struggle. We've already been told of multiple LNG projects that have either been put on hold or companies have pulled out of them because, the economics right now with oil being so low. And so In addition to the perfect storm and supply and demand falling apart, we also have both of the commodities that we produce and that we rely on here in Louisiana, and oil and natural gas, both seeing significant price destruction with not a lot of optimism for any short-term rebound at all. Next slide. Really, man, like two and a half weeks ago, we sent a survey out to our membership talking about the price decline. At that point, it was really focused on, we hadn't really gotten the full grasp of the demand side of the equation collapsing. And what does it mean to our members? And we asked a lot of questions about what does this mean for your workforce? What does this mean for your production? What are the needs that you need to be able to have a break-even price on oil, break-even price on natural gas? And then what is your wish list? What are the things that we could do if given the opportunity to provide a lifeline to you and your company? And the results were staggering. Besides that oil, we need oil to be at $37 for a break-even standpoint. If you look at where we are today, we're not anywhere close to that. $2 for natural gas, again, not where we need to be. The workforce reduction numbers were staggering, where they were expecting predicting a 60 to 70% reduction in workforce over the next 120 days, with many of those layoffs already having started. And then the same thing for production, where at these prices, a 60 to 70% shut in production over the next 120 days. And the challenge with that side is that if this production and our production in Louisiana gets shut in, much of it may not be able to be brought back. Certainly not in, if we get back to a break even and wells have been shut in for 6 months, the cost to bring those back into productions might require a higher break even point. And so we would need prices to be even higher. And all of that goes to say that it makes recovery for the industry, for our communities, for our state, for our families, much more difficult if we lose the production that we have now. If prices rebound and we can't get all that production back, that is lost revenue. So we're really focusing our efforts on what can we do to keep as many people working, to keep as many wells flowing as possible, so that if prices recover, and when they do recover, because eventually they will, that we've got as many active wells flowing in the state as possible. And so when we asked our members what were the ideas that they can do, and we'll talk a little bit more of those in details, but it was very clear that the two most important things that can happen to industry right now in order to provide a lifeline so they can keep people working and keep wells flowing would be, one, to do a suspension of the severance tax. We know, particularly on oil, we have the highest severance tax rate in the nation at 12.5%. If we can suspend, a large portion, if not all, of the severance tax, then that's cash that goes right into the operators' pockets. It brings their break-even costs down. It allows them to continue producing wells for a longer period of time. It keeps people working, and then it better positions us for recovery. There's a challenge there that we know that we have to deal with, and we've been working with Jean-Paul on, is that local governments depend on a share of the severance tax. And so there are ways that we can do that to ensure that local governments are made whole with what should be their share, given the price reduction and the environment that we're in, but also provides relief to the operators. And the other one is to address the coastal lawsuits. These lawsuits that are government-sponsored lawsuits by local governments and district attorneys across South Louisiana continue to be a drain on everybody's pockets. We have over 214 different defendants in all of these lawsuits that are spending tens of thousands of dollars on a monthly basis defending these lawsuits. Those are dollars that can be used to make payroll and to take other actions. And there's legislation that if we get back into session could be considered in Senate Bill 359. There's also actions that the governor and the attorney general can be taking if they want to be able to step in and bring a responsible end to these. The other ones really circulated on a regulatory standpoint, um, easing restrictions at the Office of Conservation, which the Commissioner of Conservation sent us a letter letting us know that if anybody needs relief, that they're there ready to provide it. And then some issues that the State Mineral Board is considering right now to suspend lease maintenance requirements and maybe a possible reduction of royalty on state land. Next question. So what is the impact from taking our survey results and looking at it from a labor standpoint and a workforce standpoint across the state? So these are the Workforce Commission numbers that came out of the most recent one, which is the third quarter of 2019. Oil and gas mining and employment's around 34,000 people with wages of about 3.2 billion. We continue to be one of the largest wage paying industries in the state. If you look at our 60 to 70% number, that puts about 23,000 people at risk statewide, and about 2.24 billion people are wages at risk. Now, again, we're talking about COVID-19 here because that's the demand side, but if on May 1st, the governor lifts the stay-at-home work order, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden everything is okay for our industry. It is going to take a long time for global demand to move back up. It is going to take a long time for the storages, the built-up storage of oil to be able to be expended. And so these numbers aren't going to magically fix themselves on May 1st. Just because we can go back to work. And so until we see some significant long-term improvement in pricing, it's safe to assume that these employment numbers and what we have at risk are going to be realized. For the Acadiana MSA, we've got about 15,000 people, which is 1.3 billion in wages. And again, that's about 10,000 people that could be lost according to our survey results. And right at close to $1 billion in total wages. Next slide. When we look at the number of wells that potentially could be shut in, it gets us right at about 17,000 wells with the current, almost 34,000 wells that could be shut in across the state. And again, these would be varying in different levels of production. Some would be ones that don't produce a lot. Some would be some that are more significant. It just depends on each individual company's ability to withstand and really for how long this downturn continues. Next. So what can we do about it? And this is where it's really important, and I appreciate One Acadiana and all the other partners for getting on, because there are things that we can do, and the more voices that can be added to the effort, the higher likelihood that we've got a chance of success. And so certainly we would appreciate anyone that wants to lend their voice to these solutions to try and position the industry so that once we get through all of this, that we're prepared to help Louisiana move forward. At the federal level, we can increase access to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So in part, that's already happening. Originally, we had 77 million barrels that were available in excess storage capacity at the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The stimulus package was supposed to provide $3 billion to be able to buy the oil to fill up the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Unfortunately, Senator Schumer and the Democrats in D.C. blocked that effort. Senator Schumer sent out an email to his colleagues claiming success for blocking a $3 billion bailout of big oil. Unfortunately, that is not accurate at how that would be portrayed. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, part of which is located in Hackberry, would have been a lifeline, is a lifeline to smaller producers across Louisiana and across, really the country, to be able to find a place to be able to put their product. And so through continued negotiation with our federal delegation and the administration, they've made 30 million barrels per day available through an RFP. I'm not 33 million. available through an RFP where companies that are looking for the ability to sell their product or put their product so that they can produce it, we can fill the strategic petroleum reserves up that 30 million barrels. There's also a commitment, although it's not done yet, to expand the remaining 47 million barrels and make it available basically through a leasing program as a commercial storage facility, if you will, for producers across the U.S. And so we're going to continue to monitor that, but it's certainly right now where storage is extremely tight is definitely a lifeline that we need. Working with our partners in the Gulf of Mexico, again, very similar to what we talked about at severance taxes, but if the Department of the Interior has the ability to reduce royalty rates in the Gulf of Mexico, which will bring the break-even cost of those wells down and allow our Gulf of Mexico operators to continue producing. For Acadiana, for Lafayette, for South Louisiana, Homa, Terrebonne, keeping these platforms in the Gulf of Mexico active is extremely important because it keeps a lot of people at work. So anything that can ease the financial burden that these operators are facing right now will be very well received and will keep people working. And the last one is expediting any regulatory relief. The administration has done a good job working with our members of our delegation, our industry, in identifying regulatory challenges. We have companies right now that are trying to build storage facilities, and whether it's the Army Corps of Engineers or other departments that are sort of putting up roadblocks, we need to do everything we can to try and get those roadblocks out of the way to make sure we're still doing everything in an environmentally and safe manner. But if we can get more storage constructed and available for producers, that's going to help offset some of the, particularly the local challenges that we're facing here, where we're just running out of storage. Next. So we talked a little bit about the state side, obviously suspending severance taxes. Representative DeVilliers has legislation. He has both a bill to reduce the severance tax rate that he filed before all of this happened, as well as a resolution to suspend the severance taxes. We're going to, obviously the state is going to have some financial challenges, but those challenges are only going to be exacerbated if we have an industry that's shutting in production across the state. And having an opportunity to work with Jean-Paul on this in some degree, but that remains the most important issue. Addressing the coastal lawsuits issue is extremely important, and then continuing to identify regulatory relief where we've got fines or we've got deadlines that need to be pushed back. Those are things that can be done in a safe manner to ease the burdens that producers, and many times many of our smallest producers are facing. We encourage and welcome the administration and Secretary Robinson's at the Department of Revenue. They've taken steps there with extending deadlines, limiting fines and other things, so that, again, to the degree that the Department of Revenue can be involved and support the industry, they're trying to do that. And then lastly, at a local level, next slide, the biggest challenge that we have will be property taxes, and we're starting to go through those, and we've been working with the Louisiana Assessors Association on solving a property tax dispute that's going on now for the better part of 30 years. And Representative Mike Huball has legislation, a constitutional amendment to do just that. However, it was not considered in the context of what we're dealing with now. And so, companies are going to be going and paying property tax rolls and looking at what they're doing next year when they're seeing wells that shut in. So we're going to be working with our local governments and our assessors on looking at the property taxes to try and ensure that we have as fair a valuation of our property taxes as possible right now. I think with that, I'll turn it over to Jean-Paul to talk a little bit about the legislature and kind of what they're seeing right now.
Gifford, thank you. This is Jean-Paul Coussan. Gifford, you really teed it up nicely. That's exactly the kind of detailed analysis that we as policymakers need in a very short amount of time to make some absolutely critical policy changes at the state level. And I realize how in depth you just went on the state and federal changes. And I'll give everyone a little inside baseball as far as what we're looking at from a state level procedurally. Right now, we're at or in an extended adjournment. The Speaker and the President of the Senate basically at some point will come to an agreement, and I assume that'll be in line with any of the governor's executive orders from a stay-at-home standpoint. But right now, we're in an adjournment, and although earlier this year, the Clay Scheck Snyder, the Speaker, named me as chairman of House Natural Resources and Environment. At this point, it's kind of incredible that I think the more important task that he's given me is as part of an economic recovery task force in the House. Basically, I've been tasked with asking all of the industries, upstream, midstream, downstream, all the stakeholders, what are their number one priorities that we need to put in place in either a regular session or in a special session to get an immediate impact on jobs and growth in the economy. And that does include for the bottom line of the businesses and the bottom line of the state. So the task force, which was put in place a few weeks ago, is a fluid situation. I've gotten responses from Gifford's group, LOGA. I've gotten responses from LAMOGA, Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association, Louisiana Chemical Association, and various individual businesses who also wanted to submit white papers to me. I'd invite anyone on this call to email me or to contact my office to make sure that your input is heard. If you have ideas relative to policy issues with the state, I'll be submitting the work product to the Speaker, and then we'll decide from a standpoint of which legislation has already been filed. Like Gifford just mentioned, we do have several bills already filed, and what may need to be filed in any special session, and what will be heard and prioritized from an industry standpoint. At this point, we know that the governor's stay-at-home order is still in place. We've heard, circulated that May 1st date may be an opportunity if we flatten the curve to lift the stay-at-home order. I would expect that if the stay-at-home order is lifted, then the Speaker and the President will call us back in to session. If our session was constitutionally supposed to end by the first week in June, which would basically give us 4 weeks, and I'd say weeks because it might be a 7-day work week for us to get through an entire session consisting of around 1,500 bills that have already been filed this year. That is probably would be the boldest move to try to get through every bill that every legislator has filed, many of which are priorities of individual legislators, their districts back home, their local governments, and individual constituents. So that would be best case scenario, is that we've got a 4-week window to get through as many bills as possible. If the stay-at-home order and the adjournment were to extend into the month of May, then we'd be making some very difficult calls about which bills would be heard in the time frame that we have allotted. Basically, we know that there are about 10 to 11 constitutionally required bills, such as the appropriations budget and our capital outlay budget, and all of the bills that are associated with those issues. So we may have to come in for a 5-day session, if that's all we were allotted, in order to get 10 bills through to satisfy our constitutional requirements prior to June 30th. If we were not able to come in at all during the month of May, then we'd be looking at a special session, more than likely only to do the 10 constitutional bills prior to June 30th, which is the end of our fiscal year. Following that, we'd be looking at a special session in the fall that would be governed by the call of either the governor or the call of the legislature, which we could call ourselves into session. So we'd be able to define the parameters of the call into the special session. I spoke with Speaker Scheck Snyder this morning. He does recognize the challenge that we're facing in the oil and gas and energy sector. And I think, from a local standpoint or in Acadiana, we understand that the COVID issue will come to pass. And once we get the healthcare crisis settled or stabilized, that we have another crisis right here in our back door with the low prices. So Speaker Sexsnyder recognizes that. He has, confirmed to me that these suggestions, these priorities that we've laid out, and specifically some of the ones that Gifford mentioned in his slides, will be part of our priority list to get people back to work. And as I mentioned, the quote that he continues to use that these bills will have an immediate impact for job growth, for the bottom lines of businesses, and the bottom line for the state. So we'll be going to the state fiscal office to get fiscal notes on all of these issues. And I do realize that with the severance tax, like Gifford just said, if we have a severance tax reduction, it may have an impact on the state for a very short amount of time. But with the prospect of these wells being shut in, that it will be probably a win over a little bit longer term if we can continue to keep these wells from being shut in. So besides that, we have the issues with the local governments dealing with the severance tax reductions, the royalty relief given from the state standpoint. What is the state going to look like if we're not receiving the royalties, if we reduce the royalty rates across the board? And from a chemical and petrochemical standpoint, we're going to be looking at detailed tax policy for property taxes that are being paid on inventory with the ITEP contracts in place, sales and use taxes on electricity and the manufacturing process, and then looking at pilots and the net operating loss deductions. So obviously, when you're looking at changing policy in the state, we're looking directly at the tax policy. So it's going to take a significant amount of substantive tax review, and like I said, it's going to take the professionals to provide us with the detailed analysis to present it to the remainder of our legislators. These are not easy asks at the legislature. Now, it may seem like it's a no-brainer for us here locally, but a lot of the state does not have the type of oil and gas industry that we have here in Acadiana, but it's hard to argue with the fiscal notes for the entire state budget when you're looking at the amounts that the reduction in our oil and gas prices have cost the state over the last 4 to 5 years. To put it in context, and basically in about 45 years ago, we were looking at around $750 million in severance taxes coming in, and now we're looking at somewhere less than $200 million coming into the state. So from a broader perspective, we'll also be looking at what's it going to look like if we took our oil and gas production and payments to the state completely out of the state budget, and used it as and basically holding it in escrow, so to speak. What would that look like for our future in planning for the future increase in prices and dedicating those funds to something along the lines of infrastructure and education? This may be the time for those types of bold moves, but we're going to cross that bridge when we get there. It will be presented, but it may not have that direct impact and immediate impact that the speaker wants at this point. But we are looking at those major changes as well and having those discussions with all of our stakeholders. If there's any questions out there, I'm happy to answer. Like I said, the main thing that I came away from this morning with the speaker was that, number one, we are still looking at all of the 1,500 bills that have been filed. So there are there are bills that deal with very specific issues across the state for our constituents. All of them have been deemed important enough by legislator to file the bills. So we're not just dismissing all of those bills yet. We're still holding out hope that we hear and listen to all of them, which includes the general tort reform bills and also tort reform relative to the oil and gas lawsuits on the coast that Gifford mentioned. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our hosts.
All right. Thank you, Gifford, and thank you, Jean-Paul. At this point, we have about 10 or 15 minutes left for Q&A. Marie Santani, founder of Santani Communications and co-chairman of One Acadiana's Governmental Affairs Committee, will be helping to moderate the Q&A portion. Please continue to enter your questions into the chat bot, and we will get to as many questions as we can. If we do not have time to get to your question during the webinar, we will try to follow up with you as soon as possible afterwards. Marie, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning. I'm just going to go through a few of the questions that I've received through the chat bot. First, are Russia and Saudi Arabia trying to deliberately tank the U.S. oil industry, and why did their actions take the oil industry seemingly by surprise?
Thank you for that question. I guess the first part is that, it's almost impossible to predict what OPEC and Russia are going to do on a daily basis. But, prices weren't high. It's not like they were $80 and industry was out there, thriving. We'd seen prices when they made this decision come down to $45. And so certainly not at a price level where, we're printing money over here in the U.S. And so I think that's part of the reason why it was a little bit of a shocker that they came along and made the decision to do that. But they did come out of those meetings and use language such as waging war on U.S. producers. It's a fight for global market share, and the U.S. used to produce about 5 million barrels a day, and we used to import all the rest. Now we're 11, 12, 13 million barrels a day. And so we have shifted because of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling and being able to produce these shale plays with 15,000 foot laterals and things that were just technologically not possible. We have taken control of our own energy security, of our own economy, and taken a large portion of market share away from both of those countries. And so they don't have the same view of the free market that we do, and so their approach is, well, we can produce oil much cheaper than you can, and we have much larger reserves than any of your companies do, and so we'll just drive you out of the market by lowering prices, flooding the world with oil, and then when prices collapse, your companies will go bankrupt. We'll get all of our market share back, and things will be back the way that we like them. So, that's their approach to managing the global market and their approach towards global politics.
Okay, I have another question related to Russia and Saudi Arabia. With demand being so low, why wouldn't Russia and Saudi reduce their output? Wouldn't they eventually have difficulty finding buyers at their price level?
Yeah. So I mean, I think their thought is that they can drive the U.S. producers out of the market. I do think, though, that their willingness to start discussing production cuts is significant in that I think they realize that storage is filling up faster than they thought it would, and demand is falling sharper and faster than they thought it would. But again, they're only going to do that provided that there's a corresponding reduction by U.S. producers. And again, the challenge there is that it's just almost impossible for us to do that without a mandate from the federal government. But what's interesting is that the production cuts that are being discussed by Saudi Arabia and Russia right now, particularly by Saudi Arabia, we don't know what the starting point is. Saudi Arabia has already ramped up production. And so if they're going to reduce production by the number that they've ramped up to, all they're doing is going back to what their original production levels were. And so there's not a really clear understanding if they're going to reduce production, eliminate the increased production, and then further reduce production as well. And so, again, if we're only talking about the part where they've increased and they're just going to not increase anymore, it doesn't really do anything to eat into the global demand destruction.
Next question. What are the best strategies that oil and gas players can use to cope with the low oil price environment?
It's an interesting question, and it depends really on the type of company. The producers we've talked to are, the first steps, obviously, they're reducing any capital expenditure and new drilling activities, focusing on the wells that are that continue to produce and bring revenue in. Ideally, you want to keep the wells flowing for as long as possible because it keeps some revenue coming in the door. It's just a difficult balance of how much time and money do you have to spend working on that well in order to keep the well flowing. And so they'll reduce capital expenditures. They're going to focus their efforts on the production that brings in the most revenue with the least amount of work. They're going to look at their team and figure out, can we reduce hours? Do we need to reduce employees? Do we have a stage down approach where if prices are here May 1st, then we do this? If the prices are still here June 1st, then these are the next steps. Kind of what we're hearing on the producer side is that we need prices back above $40 by June 1st with confidence they're going to be there, or else it's going to be devastating to the industry and to the economy locally in Acadiana. Service companies, depending upon where you are in the value chain, it could be that companies are focusing on maintenance work, and so you're good. But if you're in the land business and you're out there doing leasing on the front side, chances are that it's going to be a very difficult time, because if you're not making capital expenditures and looking at new investment and buying up new property right now, and you're focusing on the core acreage you have, it's not necessary you're not building pipelines, you're not going out there and finding new acreage, then that sector of the service industry really is going to suffer. So, a lot of it's the same steps that everyone else takes in every other business. And if you look at your employees and you look at your team and you look at your expenses and you figure out how you can tighten your belt, the challenge for industry is a lot of that happened between 2014 and 2016. And while we've been able to hire some people back, we haven't gotten back to the levels that we were before. And so there's not as much ability to reduce expenses and to cut payroll as there was maybe in 2014.
We've had a couple of questions about the impact of tariffs on imported oil, and one asking, I understand the USA refining capacity may be able to switch gears and run only USA produced crude.
Yeah, so that's the tariff question is an interesting one. So the challenge, and I'll answer the first part first. So if everyone remembers, Congressman Bustani was instrumental in working with the federal government to eliminate decade-long bans on us being able to export oil. And we needed to do that because the crude that we began to produce is not really, our refineries are not really set up to be able to refine that type of crude. And a lot of the shale crude and what's coming out of the Permian is not the type and quality that our refiners are set up to refine in the United States. And so in order to be able to have a market for it, we needed to send that over to Europe, where their refiners are set up for that type of crude. And so there's not a switch. There's not like you can't go to the Exxon refinery and say, okay, we're going to go with, Permian Basin crude today and switch it all over. So unless there's a mandate to force all of the refiners to go invest billions of dollars to retrofit their facilities to refine this new type of crude, we won't have a market for all of the crude that we produce here in the USA to be refined in the USA. So we need to be able to export it. So that's one thing that we have to be very careful about tariffs, because if we begin placing tariffs on crude that we import, first of all, you're going to have the refiners, and they're going to be, probably strongly opposed to that. But additionally, for the producers, that means that it's very likely that we're going to see tariffs placed on the crude that we're trying to export. And so the very thing that we're wanting to do to make our crude, more competitive by placing a tariff on foreign oil, we can end up with the same tariffs being placed on our product that we're trying to export and not be able to produce because of that. So, potentially long term, maybe some of the refineries will begin looking at is it, we don't really build new refineries. Is there an opportunity to make some adjustments to their existing refinery? But we haven't seen any indication at this point in time that the refining capacity is going to be updated or changed in a manner that would allow us to refine across the country, across the globe.
All right, I have a hypothetical. Suppose that all oil storage is full by mid-May. At this point, we will see significant oil bankruptcies, say 20% permanent reduction in oil production. A year from now, oil demand is back at historic levels. We will see a 20% shortfall in supply. At this point, oil will surely go to record highs and drilling will take off, and will the industry see a boom?
Yeah, so that's the roller coaster that we all ride, right? The question is, if we get to full storage capacity and we have a billion, let's say we have, for easy math, we have a billion barrels, and demand comes back up at some point in time. And I think it's really, an interesting question about when will we see demand rise again? And when I kind of pose that question, I say, when will people feel comfortable getting on an airplane with their grandparents or going on a cruise ship with their grandparents? That's going to be the question. And I think the answer probably is when we feel that we've got a cure for COVID-19, because otherwise, and come winter time, maybe it rears its ugly head again and demand goes back down. But if demand outstrips supply by 5 million barrels a day, which if we remember, when we were looking at that slide, we didn't see demand outstripping supply by 5 million barrels really ever. But even if demand outstrips supply by 5 million barrels, which would be historic in many ways, it would still take almost 400 days to eat up a billion barrels of oil in storage. And so I don't know that we're necessarily going to see that big swing. Realistically, it's going to take some time. If this goes on for much longer. But it really depends on how fast the economy wants to get going again and how much globally there is confidence in being able to travel and resuming normal life, which may come around a cure, and it may be changed forever. But I don't think we're not going to see, we very rarely see as steep an incline and recovery in prices as we do a decline.
I have a question about deep water in the Gulf of Mexico. I saw this morning Exxon cut capital expenditures 30%, operating expenditures 15%, and in particular focused many of its cuts in the Permian and mentioned they are focused on more long-term plays like deep water and other ventures. Given that, do you feel other operators will do the same? And what impacts do you see, if so, on the Gulf of Mexico deep water activity?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Gulf of Mexico is very different than the Permian, right? So, or the Haynesville Shale, where you go lease a bunch of acreage and move some rigs out there, and you can drill a new well every 30 days. The Gulf that's not the way it works. These are super large, deep water plays. Elephants is get it's often described, and so if you're going to go invest in a deep water platform and a drilling project, you're not worried about where the prices are today. You're looking at 10 years from now. Where do you think the prices will be? What is the long-term demand for energy going to be? And global demand for oil is not going away. There's pretty much every economist you look at, you're seeing the global demand for energy continuing to rise as China and India and other countries continue to develop. And so for those few companies that can withstand this downturn and still have the ability to invest billions, which really you're limiting yourself to many cases to the super majors, the ultra deep Gulf of Mexico will continue to be a viable play. For some of the independents and others that we've talked to, they're looking at shutting in their production as well, because they just can't survive in this price environment. And so how far and how long these decline in prices go will determine a lot about what happens in the Gulf of Mexico, how much activity stays there. But again, every time we see one of these downturns, we end up with fewer and fewer companies that are able to withstand the challenges and come out on the other end. And so, we look at the crash in the 80s, and it was transformative for Louisiana. We lost many of our great companies that moved and relocated their headquarters from New Orleans over to Houston, and it sort of redefined, what the industry looked like. The crash we had in recently in 14 did the exact same thing. Rigs down to 200, and we never got back up above it really for a sustained period of times above 1,000. Industry, we're going to come out on the other side, whether it's in the Gulf of Mexico or onshore. The demand for energy is absolutely still going to be there, and in many ways, the companies that come through in the industry when it comes through on the other side will be stronger and better, and positioned to take advantage of the next cycle in energy prices. The challenge for Louisiana is that are we going to have a part in that? Besides being the service company that helps out in the Gulf of Mexico, but even still, we've taken that in some cases at local levels through local assessors and attorneys, certainly through local governments filing the lawsuits that we're having, our tax policies, our auto insurance rates. We consistently have policies that make it more difficult for businesses and oil and gas companies to want to do business here. And so when prices rebound, which they will, and industry recovers, which it will, if we're going to continue to tax inventory that's destined for the offshore Gulf of Mexico, then those companies, when they're starting to rebuild their operations, are going to rebuild them in Mobile or Biloxi or Beaumont, and they're going to get away from these insane policies that we have here, which is what Jean Paul and the other legislators are working on, is how can we position ourselves to be able to take advantage and make this an opportunity for recovery, as opposed to just another story where there was a downturn in oil prices and we lost all of our E&P companies, and now we're losing all of our service companies. And so, I mean, it's a real challenge that we have to fight.
So on that note, I have a final question, and it's more for Jean Paul. As we do work towards solutions at the Louisiana level in the legislature, what can we do? What sort of advocacy do you need from us to support these efforts?
When I've heard from individual constituents and businesses, I've asked them, number one, I've given them my email address to send me their ideas, but I've also asked them to work within the associations that they're part of, whether it's LOGA, LOGA, Louisiana Chemical Association, and local like One Acadiana, so that we have the strongest voice moving forward. So when we're trying to pass legislation, if we've got the firepower behind us, then we have a much better chance of getting some of these initiatives across the goal line. So contact your associations, email your legislators. I saw that there was a question about all of the emails for legislators. Find out who your local legislator is, your House member, your Senate member. Send them an email, and then we'll all work together as a team to basically put a lobbying effort forward to get some of these major priorities across the finish line. I did see another question in there, Marie, about whether we were going to hear, somebody has a butterfly bill filed. Well, in fact, I went from the possibility of hearing 1,500 bills all the way down to only hearing 10 bills. I think we're going to fall somewhere in the middle of that. The speaker has already asked us to individual legislators to pull non-essential bills, and so that they're not heard at the committee level. But our committees, which we have 16 of in the House, the committees are set up to kill bills, whether because they're bad policy or not deemed important at this time, at this juncture. So, we're prepared as chairman to kill or pass bills that fit the criterion that the speaker has set up for us. But I don't intend on letting any butterfly bills through, and hopefully that the legislators have taken it upon themselves to remove those, so we don't waste any time on them. So I agree 100%.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you again to Gifford Briggs of LOGA, Representative Jean-Paul Coussan, and Marie Santani for leading today's presentation and Q&A. Thank you to all of our participants for joining us. We are going to be sharing the video and other materials from today's webinar within the next 24 hours. You can access the materials as soon as they're available at oneacadiana.org/COVID-19-resources. And all of the partner organizations like LOGA and others who made today's webinar possible We'll be sharing the video and materials as well. We hope today's webinar was helpful, and we look forward to offering additional Acadiana Business Resource webinars going forward. Stay tuned for follow-up emails from us and our partners. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you all again, and please stay safe.